there was adequate cause for disbelief in the narrative of the conscientious Venetian. As late as 1300, Western Europe looked upon the outer world with the eyes of superstition. From biblical tradition and from the words of the early church fathers, from Greco-Roman philosophers, those who thought at all about the farther spaces of the earth were convinced that their world was round and flat and immovable. The sun and planets revolved about it in fixed cycles, and it was encircled by vast ocean. Beneath this terrestrial orb ran the river Styx and burned the fires of hell. Above it extended the unknown geography of heaven, about which there was much speculation. More precisely, the Garden of Eden was supposed to be on a height somewhere in northwest Asia, which, considering that the Hindu Kush Himalayas is the area where the earliest known humans exist, about 4 million years before we know of them in Africa. Yeah, I was surprised too. Out of this region ran the rivers of paradise. To the north and south stretched the zones of uninhabitable cold and heat. And I do believe there's revelation and inspiration. But one of the things, a lot of people's either altered it with what they presume to be the truth, their mythologization of reality, or what they perceive to be reality, or people just made up stories to explain things with no basis at all and mix them in with that, or just compose their sacred history. They didn't really have the spiritual guidance, but I mean, they were trying to be spiritual with it, but you know what I mean. The spiritual realms weren't guiding them to compose this. Knowing souls, it is true, had begun to doubt that the Elysian fields could be found in the first strata beneath the earth's surface, or that the races of Amazons and Pygmies, who battled for their lives against the cranes of the upper air, really existed as the early Greek magists had supposed. Herodotus remained their authority upon the marvels of Asia, and Alexander's conquest of that vast unknown terrain had been magnified into tales of treasure found and magicians combated that would have delighted the good Rusticiano, I'm not sure, who had written much of Merlin. So Western thought so clung to its belief in the sea of darkness, the monsters that inhabited the deeps, the dog-headed people, and that other race of the giant feet which were used as parasols against the heat of the midday sun. Prester John, the land of the Magi, were, in the popular conception, the main points of interest in the Far East, where perhaps Eden might not, after all, be visible to mortal eyes. Jerusalem remained the center of the habitable earth. Was there not a knob of marble in the Holy Sepulchre that marked the exact center of the round world? Well, if you're going to say the center of the landmass, Jerusalem is close to the center. It's not as close as Mecca, but of course, biblically, it's the prayer direction, so you know, in the Bible, Jerusalem is the prayer direction. Was there not a knob of marble in the Holy Sepulchre that made the exact circle of the round center of the round world? Yeah, no, but in various ways, no. In general, the accurate summing up of Strabo and the scientific calculations of Eratosthenes were little heeded. The known facts of the campaigns of the Romans into eastern Parthia and the Caucasus were ignored, and the carefully devised geography of Ptolemy of Alexandria, he told us where Atlantis really was, and the Berbers will tell you some of that too, attracted little attention in the West. The much more accurate map of Idrisi, etched in Sicily, seemed to be unknown, while the knowledge of the Arab scientists had been discounted at first because the Arabs were pagan and worse, followers of that archfiend Mahound, as they called Muhammad ibn Abdullah. So the geography of fable still prevailed over the recording of science, see? Because Islam looks to the book of nature, the book of the self. Christianity, you take off the natural man, and rather than working nature, you're better than nature. It's so that's why they were against that. And pagan was a term. Pagan and heathen were used as hate speech for all monotheists. If you believed in one God, Christians say it, but Trinity refutes that. If you're monotheist rather than polytheist, you were considered pagan. So Jews and Muslims, well, not all Jews are monotheistic. But how many, some of them are not monotheist. But anyways, calling people pagan and heathen and infidel and Gentile and stuff just because they're of a different religion is not right. But opinion was changing in the lifetime of Messer Marco. The remnants of the Crusaders drifting back from the east brought with them a much more accurate picture of the nearer half of that unknown expanse, together with an appreciation of the Arab cosmographers. Roger Bacon had discussed the real shape of the eastern earth with Fra Ruquis. One Marnus Sonatus drew an outline of the Near East in discussing ways and means to recapture Jerusalem. The Venetian and Genoese merchants, thriving on the Kipchak slave trade of the Black Sea and the diamonds of Golconda, the spices of the Far Indies, made clear the course of the trade routes into the farther east. In spite of the disbelief in Messer Marco's detailed account of China and its seas, the more enterprising spirits realized that Cathay must exist where the Garden of Eden had vanished without trace. The great Khan did rule where Prester John seemed not to be. The Fortunate Isles might be the spice-giving islands. There were, indeed, incredible things beyond Thule. This growing awareness of the richness of reality came at a time when the spirit of venture was stirring in the West. The furs of Muscovy, for Moscow had become known as a trading point, were priceless ermines and sables worn by the Tatar Khans of the Golden Horde. The medicinal rhubarb and ginger, once cultivated by Yeliu Chaotsai, healed many ills of the meat-gorging Westerners. The Chinese silks that Burkai had liked when he was bartering for jewels with those jewel experts. The elder Poles were becoming the fashion among the ladies. The elder polos were becoming the fashion among the ladies of the small western courts. The spices of Java helped make dishes of too ripe meat palatable. It was all real, and in time the keen, bargaining western minds perceived that more profit lay in reality than in fable, and those careful, mercantile minds did not arrive at the conviction of reality with any flash of enlightenment. They were drowsy with long stagnation and the nepenthe of superstition. But the small, bearded presence of the Nestorian Bar Salma in Rome did dispel the illusion of Prester John. Letters of the Khakans and Ilkhans did make clear that the Mongols ruled over actual domains both vast and wealthy. Never before had there been such a contrast between the resources and culture of the East and the poverty and superstition of the West, and never again would the contrast be so great. It was Messer Marco's misfortune that he tried to make clear the one to the other, so he suffered the common fate of prophets who returned home. The enterprising Westerners were beginning to restore the balance, and they were enabled to do so because the Mongols had perfected the caravan and post roads from the edge of Europe all the way through to Tabriz, Delhi, Samarkand, Al-Malik, and across that blind spot of the Gobi to Kambaluk and Zaitan, their post stations, with the equivalent of hotels and remote herds, had made travel speedier than along the trails of Europe. No bandits infested the Yam of the Mongols, especially in the opening of the 14th century when the Ghazan-inspired truce prevailed with its profound sense of security. In this linking of west to east during the century from 1275, when Messer Marco arrived at the court of Kublai, to 1375, when communication was broken down, was born the modern West. The natural inventiveness of Western minds was fed by contact with the actual achievements of the East. The ever-progressing German brains were studying the explosive qualities of black saltpeter and sulfur and charcoal, together with the possibilities of ink applied to a wooden slab and pressed against a sheet of the new paper. The first printed books were a-making, and at the same time the first cannon were beginning to roar against stone walls, while the Franciscans of Assisi painted Chinese-inspired frescoes on their refectory walls. This awakening or renaissance of the West drew its stimulus from the East, and, well, also the South from places like Timbuktu and stuff, but, in Africa. Messer Marco had not written his last testament in the name of the eternal God, amen, when Europeans awoke to the full realities of the unexplored East. For a few keen minds had begun to compare the growing mass of evidence that markets existed in the East and could be reached. Marnus Senatus was writing his secrets for the faithful of the Lord. The good Franciscan Odoric of Pordenone was being carried eastward on the stages of the Mongol roads, although he was deterred around the Afghan country where Chagatai clans were raiding the northern plain of India, and Odoric was writing of Kinsai that had been then gone. It is the grandest city of the world, with its 2 lakes and canals like Venice, and it is a wonder to me that within it so many races could exist in peace, administered by one power. Well, some faiths don't have racial or even gender prejudice built into it. The same Odoric found a Christian archbishop in Taitu, for the papal advisors at long last had realized the urgency of sending missions into the East, missions for which Mangu and Kublai, Bar Salma and Marco Polo, and other envoys of the Mongol courts had asked in vain for nearly 50 years. Friars minor were making the eastern journey in groups, establishing bishoprics from the Crimea to Zaitan, building cathedrals and monasteries, one of them near the palace of the great Khakan. John of Montecorvino was to spend his lifetime there and to earn the respect of the last Mongols. This was the half-century of truce, the Indian summer of the nomad peace of 1300 to 1350 of the Common Era, And now the Europeans were beginning to realize the shape and extent of the world. Piccolotti's book followed Messer Marco's and the work of Marinus. When this truce ended and the Venetian and Genoese were driven from the Black Sea region, the Catalan map was drawn, giving the first crude semblance of the real world. Then, by aid of this new knowledge, the Portuguese and Spanish navigators began to feel their way down the African coast to find a sea route to Asia. They found that Africa stretched interminably to the south. Messer Paolo Toscanelli of Florence drew up a plan showing how he believed the shore of Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic. He had read Messer Marco's repetition of the Mongol tale about Japan, that plates of gold covered its palaces, and gold and pearls abounded in this fabulous isle. That island, Toscanelli wrote, could certainly be reached. An ambitious man of Genoa, Columbus, also read Messer Marco's book, and he sailed in the service of the King of Spain to find these islands, with a letter for the Khan of Cathay. When he returned from the land he had discovered, he wrote that they lay favorably for commerce with the great Khan. He never knew that he had made his landfall on the North American continent. He had reached a new world and thought it to be the outlying islands of Asia. Some of the Turks and Arabs had already been to America at that point, and maybe they could have told them that it wasn't, well, they didn't want to believe anything of people of other faiths, so this is why they were so behind. But other ships found their way around Africa, miniature clumsy caravels, armed with cannon. Gunpowder loaded into these cannon had become an improved weapon of civilization. These ships came seeking the spices, the precious things of Asia, yet they came armed. The era of sea commerce had begun, and with it, the invasion of Asia by Europe. While the exploration of the North American coasts went on with the voyages of the Portuguese to India, a third movement was taking place as vital as these. Unheeded by the Western Europeans, it progressed slowly into the east. Russia was freeing itself from the Tatar dominion and advancing towards the steppes. The Russians were moving into the forest of Sibir toward the homeland of the nomads to repeople northern Asia.